Thank you very much, Kathleen. And good afternoon, good morning to everyone, wherever you are. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to the 8th meeting of the Roundtable on Financing Water, a thematic meeting focused on climate action. With COP26 only a few weeks away from us, this is a very timely meeting to highlight how investment and water security can contribute to climate action and underscore the role of finance in contributing to a net zero, a carbon neutrality future, a resilient and water secure future. Recent events have driven home the urgency of these issues. This summer was marked by a series of catastrophic, dramatic water-related events, including severe flooding and heavy rains in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Japan, wildfires and droughts in the US, Turkey, Greece, Algeria, and Russia. In August, the IPCC stated in their most recent publication, as well as the World Meteorological Organization, that the present state of many aspects of our climate system is unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years, with severe changes to the global water cycle now and in the future. We broke the water cycle, we broke the nutrient cycle, we broke the carbon cycle, so we are paying for the consequences of that. While climate change exacerbates exposure and vulnerability to water risk, water can also be a key enabler for successful adaptation and mitigation efforts. On the one hand, I have to say that water-related investments, such as sustainable irrigation, nature-based solutions for flood protection, drought management, and climate-resilient water supply and sanitation, can strengthen the resilience of economies and communities, increase, of course, the capabilities of adaptation of our countries. On the other hand, water accounts for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and many utilities globally invest to become carbon neutral. Access to water is a critical requirement for some types of renewable energy and a condition to mitigation efforts. Water's central role in climate action needs to be acknowledged and factored in by governments, corporates, and financiers. The Roundtable on Financing Water provides a dedicated forum for action-oriented discussions among a diverse range of investors, policymakers, and experts. I do believe that this meeting pushes the boundaries on related issues. Today, we will hear about the scientific evidence about the key interlinkages between water security and climate action, and we will learn about the experience of a range of financiers on the role finance and investment can play to deliver on this ambition. Tomorrow, we will explore two fascinating topics, which really can change the game. First, how environmental risk may translate into material financial risks to the financial system. Understanding the potential exposure of the finance community to environmental and water risks is a first step to potentially redirect mainstream finance towards investments that, at a minimum, do not increase exposure and vulnerability to water risk. Second, how improved access to finance and better targeting of existing financial flows can contribute to resilient water security while promoting a broader policy and societal goals related to environmental justice and women's empowerment. This is yet another illustration of how investment in water can drive the development agenda, the SDGs agenda. For this roundtable meeting, I would like to extend my appreciation to the US government, notably the US Department of State and the US Environment Protection Agency, EPA, for their really excellent cooperation in co-convening this meeting and for their support of OECD's broader work on financing water. It is remarkable that this event has generated great interest with around 500 people registered with participants range from governments, development banks, commercial financiers, and private corporates, academia, research institutes, to NGOs. So I invite you to actively engage in the discussions and join us to broaden our collective efforts to scale up water-related investments contributing to climate action and to provide inspiration to tackle the challenges of the coming decades. In the meeting, we will have for the first time our new OECD Deputy Director for the Environment, Ingrid Barnsley. She's here. It is the first time that you will interact with her. So I'm delighted to pass the floor to Ingrid, and I really look forward to hearing back from your collective work. So enjoy these 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. Thank you also, Kathleen. I want to add my thanks to those of our director, Rodolfo Lacey, and also Kathleen, to all of you as participants and our speakers, and also to the US for their support for this event. While the next session will start to get down into concrete and practical examples of the investment opportunity in this space, this first session builds in a way on the remarks of Director Lacey by setting the context in terms of how water has the potential to be an enabler in the context of our efforts on climate action. So with that, I'm very pleased to invite Roger Pulwati to take the floor to take the virtual floor, I should say, for a keynote. Mr. Pulwati is the senior scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States, and he's going to speak to us about the interlinkages between water security and climate action in order to set the scene for the rest of the roundtable. Thanks.
Great, thank you for having me. It's immensely appreciated. And thanks for this opportunity. Is my screen being shared?
Can you retry that, please, Roger?
Yes, will do. Yeah. Let me see if I can do that again. Sorry about this.
There we go. We see you now on video, and if you just
right.
The share screen.
Let's see if we can share the screen again. Great. Okay, there we go. It worked swimmingly before, of course. All right.
There we go. We see it.
So far, so good.
Yep.
We're almost there. I am. Yes.
Great.
Okay, how's that?
That's great. We can see it. Perfect. Over to you.
Okay, great. So I'll get a move on since we're a bit late. So my name is Roger Pulwati. I work with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It was just introduced. Thanks very much for that. I'll speak a little bit about the climate issue and then some of the things that have been happening in the way we think through the issue of water financing in the context of a changing climate. And so we know change is ahead, and the IPCC Working Group 1 has come out, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. Most critically, what we're seeing, of course, ever since the special report on extremes and other, I was the convening lead author for adaptation and the fifth assessment and some things before that on the water report. But the most important thing here from my standpoint is we can, in fact, and we have been able to use very traditional, very classic approaches to managing risks, simple risks, complicated risks. But then we're in the realm of complex compounding and cascading risks. And as Working Group 1 has shown, not only are we seeing in certain parts of the world the increasing risk of floods or heavy inundation events, but certainly the increasing risk of droughts in between those. And most critically, issues surrounding soil moisture and the quality of land and vegetation surfaces. So there's an interacting complex and compounding cascading risk. And we're going to speak on this session a little bit about what does that mean in the context of water financing and what's our latest thinking on this and how can we think through the pathways. So as we go through this, as my friends in national security likes to say, give me the bluff. What's the bottom line up front? Changes in water quantity and quality, of which we have been able to document and seen. We're also seeing, as I'll mention in a second, some parts of the world in which not simply unfamiliar, but unprecedented events are actually taking place. We see deteriorating water infrastructure at risk. On the right there, it shows you the aging of dams in the US, when they were built and how old they are. That's from the National Climate Assessment Report. And then the issue of what it means to manage and the right to manage in a changing climate. And in that context, across the board, the WMO I chair the Climate Services Information System team for the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, just released a report showing how the key features of climate change, everything from glacial melt to ocean acidification to changes in temperature, affect all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, water is the central one that is affected by all of the changes that we're seeing. So what's the bottom line up front? Examples of promising approaches to manage climate-related water risk exist, and I'll mention some of those, but the gaps between knowledge and implementation still remains a challenge. We know this. This is one of the purposes behind this workshop. I'm really grateful to Kathleen for having the vision and helping to craft the direction and helping us think through some of these issues in non-trivial ways. But those challenges are especially regarding systemic compounding and cascading risks, and I'll give you some examples of those. Here's one picture, the built environment of urban systems and cities. This isn't from Hurricane Ida, an event that we've recently had to deal with in the state. This is actually post Hurricane Harvey, and the cascading consequences of heavy rainfall for urban systems. So as we look at this is street catchment, the treatment facility, and in cities with combined sewer systems, storm runoff flows into pipes, increasing risk of exposure to waterborne diseases, closed roads, and disrupted mass transit. And this is in a developed city that is, has a transportation network. And of course, we're thinking through what this means as we build and build back better, as the Biden administration likes to phrase it, a really good phrase that's strongly linked to the Sendai Agreement. As we think through this, we're also asking the questions, how is flooding changing? And as we know from the data and the information work done by NOAA and our partners around the world, that we're seeing storms coming into the US and elsewhere, certainly in the Atlantic. I'm originally from the Caribbean, that are wetter, that are more slowly moving. But then when they impact with the built environment, they spread, the flood waters spread in ways that were not anticipated. In many cases, when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston or Katrina in New Orleans, the flooding actually played a big role in releasing toxic waste into the system. But while we're doing that, there's some really good work being done on blue-green infrastructure, the greenways, the clear waterways. And here's an example from Stantec that basically shows, certainly for a place like New Orleans, and we'll see how this featured with Hurricane Ida, is that when we put in a mix of this infrastructure, there are the benefits. Avoided subsidence, avoided flood damage, all the way down to reduced air pollution and public health benefits that you can quantify to some extent. But as we know from years of working in disaster risk reduction, while we know $1 can save X amount into the future, our actions are not commensurate with realizing those savings in practice. So the question is, how do we get ahead of the ways in which we finance such risks? Here's another example that we're actually going through right now. This is from 2018, but we're actually experiencing it in 2021 in the US as well. The critical infrastructure dependence on water and potential degradation following the loss of water services. This was done by Homeland Security using data from NOAA and elsewhere. And what we did in this report was basically show how something like drought filters through not just agricultural crop losses, but the electricity systems, the transportation networks, water and wastewater treatment plants. So this gives a sense broadly of the spread and cascading types of impacts that we see from single events. And as we know from IPCC, from various national assessments, that in fact, the nature of those events are themselves changing. And what I mean by that is this: while in some parts of the world we can say wet is getting wetter, dry is getting drier, it's actually not that straightforward, because the atmospheric circulation changes where wet gets wetter and where dry gets drier, introducing a greater sense of uncertainty and actually the possibility for exceeding even some of the projections that we've seen. There are, however, some good examples. In a place like Las Vegas, they're paying to save water, adding turf, water smart landscapes. In a small town in California, an aggressive community conserves about 5 billion liters of water a year and has put in 500,000 meters squared of turf into their setting to produce the kind of benefits I was just showing. They all work on setting targets for resilience and for what reasonable levels of use, a high degree of acceptability means. and they go big on investing in efficiency and reuse. The payback is over time. The benefits of participation, the social cohesion brought by that is now. Introduction of high efficiency appliances, turf replacement, leak detection devices. And as some of you know, within the US, the total amount of water being used has actually leveled off since 1975, and we're not actually able to see a blip in the gross domestic product because of that, because of efficiency, because of policy and regulation, and because of behavioral changes. So I'm going to speak to two reports that I was engaged in that tries to get this notion of how we get at the issue of drought as an example in the context of climate change. Drought is slow onset, has multiple impacts over time, can cover a watershed, or it can cover thousands, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers that we're seeing in the Southwest US at this time, and in certain parts of Southern South America. We also released the first special report from the Global Assessment on drought. It was the first time that a full report had been done on drought. And these two were actually done in parallel. There's a technical working group for the UNCCD, which I co-chair, that produced this effort on drought finance. And then the Drought 2021 report of the UNDR that takes into account the changes we're seeing from IPCC and elsewhere, but asks the question, what does this mean for finance, governance, and planning? So there were cases taken from around the world, different watersheds, transboundary cities, and elsewhere. And we asked the question, as people are living through this, what is being learned? This is a complex figure, but the reason for showing it is the titles up above. This was produced as part of the UNCCD report by Caroline King-Okumu, and there's a lot of us put into what the data is behind here. What this shows is that you can have systemic risk, but we have to ask, where are the investments to be made so that we do not increase drought risk, and where can we put them in a timely fashion so that we increase resilience? And these data and information is actually, they're all empirically based. This confusing list of things gives the entry point from soil quality to the hydrologic deficits that cascade into increasing drought and water scarcity risk, to the other side of what better soil quality, water conservation of the type I was just showing you. So it gives a picture of which pathway do we want to take, and given systemic risks, globally networked, local imbalances, and the contagion and planning that happens out of that, where should our investments take place? So we had a series of examples drawn from that larger set. From Costa Rica, there are examples on the microfinance for ecosystem-based adaptation, the revolving fund for drought resilience, the emerging innovations on blockchain, water rights, and so on, and resilience bonds, the Future Drought Fund in Australia, the climate insurance for hydropower stability, Zimbabwe, risk pooling for AfriRisk, and Grain for Green, national productivity safety programs. And these are all documented in the report I just mentioned. But what I wanted to show here was this. I put this up on here. It's a very detailed looking slide, but the instruments for drought finance are multiple. There's not one piece. We worked in the special report on drought to see where the alignment among the Sendai Agreement, the SDGs, Aichi biodiversity targets, and adaptation post-Paris would play a role. And of course, it's multiple concessional loans, blended finance, microcredit, revolving loan funds that produce savings, contingency budgets, small scale savings, microinsurance, informal risk management. And we've mapped out where these have benefit people at different levels, subnational, national businesses, and others. So this is meant to be, it's a very detailed slide, but I put it up there just because to give you a sense that we looked very closely at the mixes of finances in trying to deal with the continuum from risk to resilience, where we deal with what is happening now and what might be happening into the future. The proactive aspects of, if this is happening relative to what we see in IPCC, what do we do? And then the other question of prospective risk, which is how do we reduce the likelihood of new risks emerging? And this mix is being applied in different ways in the cases that I mentioned. Most critically, the three things we ask coming out of this is to broaden the actor network. Who is playing a role in risk governance, from the vertical global to local, and horizontal across watersheds, across partners, across electricity grids and others, to ensure the authority and policy coherence, partnerships, and decentralization of action while coordinating on accountability and efficiency. We're not getting away from that. And then we speak to, well, what are the requirements for making these decisions into the future? The third area is risk layering across the nodes. Finance has to address both the layering and the risk reduction. Donor assistance, insurance-linked securities, insurance and reinsurance, contingent credit, and the reserves that are used basically to reduce the stock of risk that people are facing relative to water scarcity and too much or too little water. So this is all documented in those reports I mentioned, and there's the data and so on behind it, but it gives us a sense of how we're trying to deal with a complex risk in a changing climate. So my last slide basically comes out of the GAR report. Water is human, drought is human, right? We know there's a lot of, water plays not just an economic role, but a cultural role, certainly an environmental role in what we do. And to move towards adaptive risk governance for water requires both the vertical and the horizontal, and to understand where the links between those nodes apply. Managing for resilience is not the same as managing for efficiency. So we need to support the establishment of a mechanism across all of these pieces and to develop the resilience architecture of partnerships that work to ensure the seamless link between public, private, and civil society, equity, economy, and the environment to reduce the stock of risk. The challenge is sustaining those networks across research, observation, services, and decision-making. There's an old set of characters, very ancient ones, on the combination of how we manage and interact with the natural system, how we learn from it. As had been said long ago by one of my mentors, Gilbert White, we do not manage life systems, we manage our interactions with them. But I always like to put up this slide because this shows that even the littlest among us know that a little collaboration will get you some water. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pulwati, for that excellent context setting for the opening of the roundtable, covering the complexities of the changes to the climate system and the role of water within that, the role of uncertainty in managing changes to the climatic system, and of course then looking at adaptive risk governance, including prospective risk, risk governance, and of course risk layering, and finishing with a very human note. We propose to take all questions at the end. We're collecting the questions along the way, and then we'll have a moderated session at the end. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to welcome Kate Lamb, who is the Global Director for Water Security at the CDP, and also the UNFCCC Water Champion for COP26. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Kathleen, and to the rest of the OECD team for inviting me today and convening this important session. I'm really delighted to be able to be here with you all today. As is hopefully now clear to you all, COP26 is our last chance to course correct before humanity suffers the worst effects of climate change. The science is clear and the evidence is hard to ignore. The IPCC report released earlier this month rings the alarm loud and clear that climate change is causing global impacts and possibly irrevocable disasters. And we've just heard once again, about the urgency of the situation that we're facing. Droughts are already 70% more frequent, and indeed in the next decade, intense rainfall is 50% more likely. Every degree of warming, therefore, counts. And the time for urgent action is now. We need all hands on deck. As you know, just as well as I know, water connects us all, forcing us to think beyond sectors, beyond industries, and even beyond boundaries. Where water management is fragmented, it needs integrating, coordinating, and regulating in order to manage trade-offs and ensure inclusive stewardship right down to the local level. At COP26, we want more countries to prioritise adaptation and translate their climate risk into resilient water investment. In this spirit, we need to see fundamental policy, organisational and regulatory reform that will attract both public and private investment. Reforms that allow us to harness the power of the market, whether that's increasing water disclosures by businesses and investors, or by linking consumer and producer countries in their water stewardship and resilience efforts. This is why I'm delighted to be here talking to you today. As the Chinese proverb states, not only can water float a boat, it can sink it also. Water can be a significant driver for innovative and sustainable economic prosperity, but its mismanagement can result in significant business failure. As problems of governance, scarcity, and pollution have spread and intensified, interest in protecting water has diversified. More than ever before, finance leaders realize that their long-term profitability and even short-term viability depends on having the right quantity and quality of water available at the right time and place to meet the needs not only of their own businesses, but also of the businesses they invest in, and importantly, of the people and landscapes that surround those businesses. This awakening is exciting, particularly when one remembers the size and influence of the financial market. With $124 trillion in assets, the banking industry alone is bigger, more profitable, and more powerful than ever before. And yet, according to a recent study by JP Morgan, less than 2% of global capital allocation made by all of these financial institutions is graded as sustainable. That means, in other words, 98% of all of the money flowing throughout the global economy is, at this stage, actively working against our goals and undermining our ability to achieve a water secure, net zero, and resilient future for all. This flow of money is enabling agribusinesses to pump ever-increasing amounts of non-renewable groundwater. It's enabling tailings dams to be constructed at the heads of free-flowing rivers, and it's enabling chemical, apparel, and pharmaceutical companies to release toxic pollution, much of which is carcinogenic, posing a real and present danger to human health. But it can also be the key to changing all of this. Imagine if this flow of capital was working in our favor. Imagine if it was providing the incentive, the spark for the world to grow differently, and hence affect freshwater resources really radically differently. The decisions that you take, your insights and your innovations and your solutions will help put the world on a path towards net zero and increase resilience in order to give all of us the greatest chance to protect the most vulnerable people. So what has this all got to do with COP26? Well, as the UNFCCC's high-level climate champions lead for water, it's a mouthful. My business card has now gone this long rather than this long when I used to only work for CDP. I'm on a mission to encourage large numbers of scientists, financial institutions, businesses, and cities to drive ambitious action on water for climate change, and ultimately to get the world committed to a net zero resilient future by 2050 at the very latest. I therefore look forward to your active participation in Glasgow just 38 days from now. And ultimately, and possibly more importantly, I look forward to your active participation beyond this event in terms of tackling this vital agenda. Water plays an absolutely pivotal role in achieving our climate ambitions. Indeed, the water and climate crises are now, they're not separate events, they are one in every meaningful sense and should be treated as such. And yet the OECD found that just 16% of all climate finance is currently flowing towards climate resilience or adaptation. Without a doubt, ensuring that our investment, lending and insurance policies and strategies harness the power of water whilst protecting it for future generations is an absolutely essential and ambitious undertaking. The leadership on show, both today and tomorrow in this vital event, if adopted at scale, will position us well to deliver it. By investing with water resilience in mind and as a desired outcome, we can reduce climate risks to people, ecosystems and economies, whilst mitigating large volumes of GHG emissions. I hope that what you learn over the next 2 days will facilitate stronger, more ambitious outcomes at COP26 and lead to lasting positive change. If not now, then when? Before I end, I want you to take a moment to imagine, because this is not something we do enough of in our daily lives, particularly at the moment when we're all so busy moving from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. So please stop multitasking for a moment, close your inboxes and listen. Imagine that it's 2030 and that we're celebrating the achievement of SDG 6 at the final global stocktake together. Together, we have delivered unmitigated success. And you stop for a moment to recognize just how different your clients and investees' businesses are compared to today. You also recognize that your own institution has undergone a radical transformation. You're more hopeful than you have been in a very long time. Reflecting on the past few years, you realize that so much of what has changed stems back to the changes triggered by the actions you took following this amazing OECD workshop, and that you decide to put the full weight of the financial system to work to water. What a lovely thought. And there's no reason why together we cannot achieve this outcome. Indeed, we must achieve this outcome. So I invite you all to join this effort. Your challenge now, should you choose to accept it, is to think carefully about the next steps that you take and consider whether these are taking you closer to being part of the solution or further away from that and closer to being part of the problem. You have all the tools that you need, and the time has never been better. So it's time to get to work. Thank you so much, Ingrid, and again to the rest of the team. And I wish you a really successful conference over the next 2 days.
Thank you, Kate, for those inspiring words. Kate's spoken to us about the increasing high-level policy interest in water and how this can be leveraged, in a sense, for ensuring climate resilient societies, the importance of an integrated approach, the need for an inclusive approach as well, and a focus on adaptation, but also specifically a focus on resilience and the timeliness of action now in the context of what we're trying to achieve, not only now, but indeed looking ahead to 2030 and beyond. So thank you, Kate. With that, I'm pleased to invite Julian Tuati to close as our final keynote speaker, a partner in corporate and corporate development dictator at Meridian. Welcome, Julian. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to all the OECD team for putting together this event on what is clearly a key topic. If I go back to the title of these 2 days, putting finance to work, I like that. For net zero resilience, what a secure future. Maybe 2 words. So I had the chance to work for a very long-term climate-minded investor, Meridian, where I actually oversee energy transition. I have also been lucky enough to have recently led the acquisition by Meridian of 40% of the so-called new Suez, which is going to be one of the 5 largest water utilities globally. And actually, we see this company from a financial investor perspective as a fantastic platform to contribute to delivering affordable water in a context of climate change. So I will take a slightly different perspective from what has been described and what was extremely inspiring, and give the perspective of an investor. So I will start first with one question, which is, what are the routes for investors? By investors, I mean here institutional investors, my clients, asset managers, to access water investments? That's a question which is not so easy to answer, because actually, as it has been said, we are dealing here with a sector that is quite scattered compared to other infrastructure sectors. The value chain of water, if you look at it as a service, is capital intensive, but it's clearly capital intensive, and so cost of capital matters, but it's not as capital intensive as other infrastructure industries. Just to illustrate that, I want to give you a rough order of magnitude. So taking my home country, France, but just for the sake of the order of magnitude, it's valid actually elsewhere. If you look at the bill that is paid by a French household for water, it's roughly speaking €4 per cubic meter. That's the order of magnitude. 40% goes to drinking water, 40% wastewater, and 20% to so-called taxes, which actually cover in France some investments, because it's collected by agencies that are in charge of managing water resources at the river basin level. If you look at the investment components, so how much of these €4 is going to investments, basically, My estimate, because it's not that easy to find the exact data, is that it's only a fourth. So which means that eventually in this business, the part that is going to the remuneration of capital, being it zero in some cases when it's fully subsidized, but is in what is paid by the end users in countries such as France, where the principal water pays for water is applied, is less than a fourth, which means that you have a lot of value also, which is outside of capital, but the capital element is important. If we focus for 2 seconds on the type of capital expenditures, CapEx, that we today have to undertake both in developed economies and in developing markets, very roughly speaking, 3 big categories: treatment infrastructure, both for drinking water and wastewater; networks, which is clearly a key topic everywhere for developing networks or simply maintaining them. That's a real challenge. And the third category that is actually serving the second one in a way, which is digital. In digital, you have smart metering. You have also the challenge of digitalizing some activities such as maintenance or supervision of the systems. If you look at projects in that space, one important point is that it's very rare to identify projects whose unitary capex, so the size of the project itself, is in excess of 100 million euros. So in general, projects are smaller. And actually, when you look at projects that are above this threshold of 100 million, you deal mainly with large-scale treatment infrastructure. So, for instance, the big projects that have attracted some investors were diesel projects in the Middle East, for instance, in some European countries, in the US a bit, but that remains quite I would say, specific. In some cases, you can find some wastewater treatment facilities that reach that size. And why am I mentioning this threshold of 100 million euros? Because it's a rough order of magnitude, but it may be the one relevant for typical infrastructure investors and for project finance. It's quite difficult actually to implement a traditional project finance approach if you are below that threshold because of the transaction costs that are quite significant for these schemes. So it doesn't mean that this approach doesn't make sense, but and it's still adapted to some of the investments in the water sector, but it addresses only a very small portion of the investment that we need to undertake. Which means that, again, from an investor perspective, if you want to approach water, in particular to contribute to the SDGs, which is a big driver today for most of the investors active in the infrastructure space, we need to think of other approaches. So there is again a very obvious one, which is you lend directly to local authorities, either through municipal bonds, direct lending, whatever, or you invest in large-scale operators, which is eventually what we have done as Meridiam when taking this share of the new Suez I was referring to. And we've been trying to invest in projects on a project-by-project basis for years, and it's not that easy because of the critical size issue I was mentioning. And these operators, it's the way the role they play for an investor is that they are platforms, aggregators of projects, and that's a way to access all these very small, very scattered projects in the geographies where the operator is active. So I use the term of platform on purpose because that's really one of the key complexities of the sector. We deal in this industry with small projects. Amounts are in millions, if not thousands of dollars, versus billions for the perfect infrastructure project that investors are looking for in general. So which brings me to my second question: should we put this in the context of fight against climate change? I mean, clearly, and it has been very well explained at the very beginning, we need to look at water differently in the context of climate change, and we need to look at both dimensions, mitigation and adaptation. And actually, what is interesting is that there is a kind of they are entangled. There is clearly a relationship between the two in this sector specifically, and I will come back to that. So first, adaptation. If you, I mean, it has been said very clearly, if you look at water network, treatment infrastructure, the sensitivity to extreme weather events of these assets is extremely important. You simply need to think of floods, for instance. So that's something which is clearly necessary everywhere in terms of upgrade of this infrastructure to basically face this kind of events. And just to take an example again in my home market, we believe a massive investment is required in France in this type of infrastructure. And that's true, unfortunately, almost everywhere. The issue when you deal with adaptation is that whilst, of course, it has a high economic value to make these investments, they will not create additional revenues per se for the water utilities. So, and at the end of the day, you said it's in a way undertaking these investments means, in a way or another, that the service of the supplying water is going to become more expensive, either for the end users, if you apply the principle water pays for water, or for the taxpayers, if you involve other sources of funding for this industry. The question here is very simple. How do we manage this in a way that is acceptable politically? And I will come back to it later. Another obvious example is water scarcity, it has been mentioned. In addition to change on the consumption side, which is always a better solution, but there are technical solutions which include fight against leaks. So in that case, that's where digitization can play a role. Development of reuse solutions, replenishing of water tables. It's a big word, but that's something you have to do in some regions. And desal, which is an example I already mentioned. All these solutions are capital intensive, and some, of course, are much more than others. Again, to give an order of magnitude, if I compare a typical drinking water production facility to desal, CapEx for a desal facility will be 3 to 10 times higher. Operations will be more costly by a factor 3. But what is to me, in a climate context, the most impressive is the energy side of it. It's well known by specialists. Consumption of electricity in a desal facility is 10 to 15 times higher than in a traditional drinking water production facility. And it brings us to this entanglement that I was mentioning, this how adaptation and mitigation speak to each other in a way in this sector. The water sector is energy dependent. Again, if we come back to the water bill, 20% of it, in most cases, it pays for energy cost. And actually, I think this dependency will increase over time. It means that we will have a growing role to be played by the water sector in a net zero future for sure. The good news is that most of the energy consumed is electricity in that sector, which can be greenified. So that's positive. But conversely, it means that access to cheap green electricity will be a key driver to preserve water affordability. And that's a challenge that I see emerging, but that is becoming more and more accurate. And I'm not sure all the market players, private and public, are paying enough attention on the ground to this specific matter. And of course, water can contribute directly to low carbon energy, even if it will remain marginal. But if you methanize sludges, for instance, you can generate biogas that can be used for other purposes. So I see this nexus between water and energy in the context of climate change as a new frontier for water finance. Last, and I will finish there, what needs to be done if we want to accelerate sustainable finance of water. So first, what I can testify today is that sustainable investors, they crave for financing sustainable water assets. Recently, there was a sustainability-linked bond offering by a European water operator that you may know, so they raised almost $1 billion at a rate which was very close to 0%. So we are talking here of private financing, 0%. And the rate will actually be indexed on 2 sustainability criteria, one related to water consumption efficiency, and the other to carbon intensity, which are 2 topics I have emphasized earlier. But the question is how more widely we can make water assets accessible to investors. So we discussed the roots in the first part of my introduction. But the thing is, we should not underestimate, that's a reality, and I think most of the participants are quite aware of that, the complexity of mixing private finance and public funding. in the water sector. It's still something that is not a given, and that is raising political acceptability concerns, legal complexity, and it has limited over time these two aspects: mobilization of private financing sources. The big challenge, and I speak as a private long-term investor, is to, in a way, think of ways to realign private and public sectors when considering such schemes. I mean, France has exported and invented a model of water PPP, Délégation de Service Public. This is a very efficient solution, but it is not universal, and it has its limits, of course. There is a challenge regarding transparency. By the way, it can be ensured in the context of water PPP, but that's another question. But I think there are very interesting experiments that we've been seeing across the OECD, by the way, and in developing markets, where you have some hybrid PPP solutions where the public sector has a minority stake, but in the company that is delivering the service, but a strong governance role. So that's an alternative to the fully public utility versus fully private utility. This is something that you see a lot in Italy, in Germany, for instance. And there is a broader challenge, which is how do we make sure that we mobilize private sector expertise and government funding at the same time. If you go only for government funding, but you don't have the expertise on the private sector, it may be quite difficult for some complex projects. I will finish on one thing, which is the affordability challenge and the need for social tariffs. This is something that is, as I was mentioning, we are going to see a likely increase of the cost of water supply. And we will need to address that politically. So social tariffs are quite interesting instruments. I mean, in particular, it works very well in the water sector. It's not always as easy in the energy sector for various reasons, but basically you can implement that in a way that is quite efficient. And I know I promised that it was my last point, so I will have a very, very last point, which is about another topic which is not exactly in the same category, but which is also a financing matter. How do we invest and how do we finance innovation in this industry? Again, an order of magnitude that is, I think, speaking almost of itself. Water utilities, in general, they spend less than 0.5% of the revenues in innovation. General Electric's 4%, Alphabet 15%. So the reality is that we have an industry which is, I think, clearly underinvesting in the future, despite, as it was very well explained, despite the long-term concern that we have about water and the essentiality of this sector. I think we need to do more, for sure, and we need probably, if I take the investment industry perspective, to work on hybrid models. Again, the concept of hybrid solutions is important between venture capital, infrastructure financing, and public markets. This is also, I think, a nexus that we need to work on, because as in for the energy transition, it could be about technology from an investment perspective, technology investments, infrastructure investments, and of course, smart mobilizing of public sector sources. I will stop here and more than happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Julian. And I think that this last keynote begins to tie in very nicely, in fact, with the second session, which will go more deeply into investment opportunities in a concrete sense. Julian spoke to the notion of the climate-water nexus as the new frontier for water finance, and gave some concrete examples from types of capex through to the transaction costs of traditional finance, and how to address how to effectively bundle up small scattered projects in order to upscale them and make them attractive to investors, right through to a range of other experiences from the example of Meridian. With that, we're very pleased to open the floor. I'm going to start, if I may, with a couple of the questions that have come in on the chat. And then I invite other colleagues to either raise your hand, we'd be delighted to hear your voice and see your face, or if you prefer, of course, to pose a question in the chat, and we'll moderate them over the next half hour. At 3 o'clock, we'll have a short break. The first question I wanted to get to was one from Kerry that came through via the chat, and this is in a sense directed to all panelists. about the role of political economy and behavioral dynamics in bringing about the shifts we might wish to see. We're at a, we're in a sense, this is, we're preaching to the converted if we're already at this meeting. How is it that we ensure that in actual fact we can align policy with what's needed in order to align financial flows in the context of political economy and behavioural dynamics. So I open the floor to our three panelists to provide some first reflections on this. Thanks.
Thanks, Ingrid. I'm happy to dive in, and thanks for your really pertinent questions. As we know, the changes that we're talking about here, the political changes, the policy changes with regards to water are not easy. If they were, they would have been made a long time ago. Hence the need to create and strengthen and boost the political will for change. And I didn't explain in my keynote, but the role of the high-level climate champions, the team that I'm seconded into at the moment, their entire reason for being is that it is to ensure that there is sufficient ambition emerging from the private sector, from civil society, from citizens, from scientists, basically anybody that isn't a central government, to shout loud and clear and showcase unequivocally to governments that it not only is the well behind them in setting and achieving their own ambitious climate targets, but that many of these non-state actors, as they're called, are already taking bold, ambitious actions themselves. And we use the term an ambition loop to put all of this theory of change into one neat package. And in fact, if you Google it, there's a report that outlines what the ambition loop is. It's grounded in the climate space at this stage. But it's my firm belief that we can and it need to create an ambition loop for water. We have this moment in 2023 when the UN are going to be hosting their first ever water summit. It's the first time in 70 odd years that there's going to be such an event taking place. And there are a large and growing number of organizations in the water community that are beginning to set their sights on that event as the moment for achieving a real political breakthrough. Now, 2023 may feel like a long way away, but it really isn't at all, certainly if we want to create this large ambition loop and spark it off. But the more that we can bring all of these voices together around a common set of messages and a common clear set of asks and work hard to elevate those into the highest platforms, it's my optimistic view that this could be one significant opportunity we have to deliver that change that we need and affect change within the political economy itself.
Excellent response. Thank you, Kate. Would either of our other panelists, Roger or Julian, like to add?
No, the answer was very clear. Thank you.
Yeah, that worked extremely well for me. I would mention one thing, however, that when we think in terms of political economy, we are also thinking in terms of trade and how globally networked risks drive local imbalances. And in doing that, it requires us to really get a handle around the idea of systemic risk. But what that really means and has to do with are a lot of the choices that we make. And we have a lot of efforts surrounding complex systems and how we think about that, but we don't really have a whole lot of great cases in which the things that we've been asking for, even nature-based solutions and so on, are not really being supported by the private sector or a public-private partnership. And so we need to advance the efforts to show the benefits to the public and the private sectors, but most importantly, to have the civil society groups who hold the feet to the fire on issues of equity. And what I mean by that is that if we're thinking through political economy, then we have to think about root causes. And in that context, whether we treat water as a service, whether or not we make ecological sustainability a fundamental criteria, or match the quality of water to its use, or even planning for a desired outcome, is a behavioral enterprise, not simply an economic one, not simply a perspective. And what we have on the panel and elsewhere are people we are aligning that our goals are in fact similar. So let's work back from that to see how we collaborate. Collaboration is easy to ask for. Vision is easy to ask for. I always tell people there's a fine line between a vision and a hallucination. We have to be very clear about the reasons why we're acting and on whose behalf and for whom do we speak. So I do think that the view of political economy, certainly cognitive and behavioral sciences have to come to bear on how we think, but most importantly, it's whether or not these changes are occurring that leaves communities with a sense of dignity.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger. With this, if okay, Julian, I'll switch to another question. This one's coming from Monica in the chat, Altamirano, who mentions that the transaction costs for blended finance are now high. What changes do we need in our current infrastructure investment planning cycles in order to be able to address this, particularly in the context of upscaling of MBS? Julian, you might wish to take that.
More than happy to try to cover that. I mean, there is no obvious answer, unfortunately, to this one, because first you have an industrial reality, which is that, and that's good in a way that CapEx are not massive individually, because it goes with the affordability of the service. So the solution is not in any case to increase the cost to reach a critical size. Now, if I answer more seriously and more concretely, I think among the challenges that we have ahead of us is to maybe find ways to bundle investment programs at a scale that is geographically significant. I'm going to take a concrete example. I was this morning with a gentleman who is leading development efforts, urban development efforts in Morocco for a local financial institution, where they are now, they have some, the municipal level, and in particular in the water sector, with a lot of investments to be made, but each of them is quite small. I mean, at the end of the day, when you sum up for a given city the investment that are required, they don't reach the size that I was mentioning, 100 million euros, even in a country such as Morocco, which is still developing in terms of service expansion. So in the thinking we had together, that would be to potentially consider to bundle the investment program of several municipalities, for instance, at a regional level, to reach a size that was more meaningful. It's a first way to answer your question more with, okay, how do we reach a critical size? But second, there is another element in your question, which is about the timing and how do you plan, because the cycles may not be the same, but it's a way from one territory to the other one. And on this, that's something I didn't mention, but we are trying to develop something which is focusing on resilience together with the Rockefeller Foundation. It was announced a few days ago that we closed one of these facilities that we are putting together, that is precisely about helping local authorities, cities in particular, to transition from the master planning to the concrete project delivery. And I think, interestingly, having in mind from day one, when you do the master planning, the capabilities, both in terms of human capital, but also in terms of the type of routes you want to use for financing is key. And you need, in general, you need a lot of resources at the very beginning and very skilled resources, but the people with a very strong knowledge of the financial, legal implications of implementing a financing of complex assets such as water, they tend to come very late in the process. So making sure that you have them on board at day one and together with the policymakers is quite important. So it's a very general answer, and more than happy to continue that. But that's where blended finance can play a role, because in general, with a small amount of capital, financial capital at the beginning, you can pay for the right expertise and make sure that you design a scheme that will be successful at the very end, a few years later, once you have finished the development of each of the projects that are comprised in the broader framework for a plan for the city. It was a long answer, but that would be my view.
No, I think it's excellent and extremely practical in this context. Thank you. That's why we're here. In fact, there's another one. You're not off the hook yet, Julian. There's another one for you, which is from Steve Senna, who says, while adaptation may not produce revenue, doesn't it reduce costs, both direct and indirect, and savings from in terms of increased resilience, which ties in turn to the remarks of Roger. In that context, should the public sector not contribute to these savings, and how can infrastructure be included more significantly within national action plans?
No, but that's a key point. And just to clarify what I was saying, I was not, I mean, for sure, we need to make these investments, and eventually they make sense economically, because we, precisely for the reasons you just mentioned, you reduce costs, you increase resilience, and Roger explained that very clearly. When you increase resilience, you increase the value. What I was saying is that compared to a scenario where there is no climate change, which was a scenario that we were hoping to live in, let's say 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it leads to an increase in cost. So basically, the same service, i.e. having access to water, is going to be more expensive in the context of climate change. That's what I'm saying. Then the question comes to who is to pay for that. And I agree. I mean, we could imagine, and that's what is done actually in many countries, public sector to step in and to finance this extra cost, taking in mind what the private sector may not be able to take fully in mind, the benefits related to this extra investment. I mean, the thing is, I'm going to take again an anecdote, but water is in general, as it's a local service, and the action plans are national. In general, the articulation between the two in terms of actual investments is very difficult. And if I take an example again in my country, I think for the first time in a stimulus package at a national level in France, we had a small bucket for water, but I think it was less than maybe 1,000th of the stimulus package that we had to put together. Why that? Because these expenses are in general borne by the local authorities, and when you go through the local authorities budget, when you think at it from a state perspective, it's mixed with many considerations, budgetary stability, financial consolidation, and so on. So at the end of the day, it's rare that you have a real national view on how water can be delivered. I'm saying that no blame here, but the reality is that this complexity between the fact that it's a local service managed locally, close to the citizens, but actually a lot of the things that are determining the cost and the overall behavior of this sector are national, if not transnational, when you think at European standards, for instance. But this complexity of dealing with the various layers is a reality.
Thank you, Julian. In a moment, I'm going to give the floor to Rajesh Balasubramanian, if I may, from the World Bank, to share experience from India with the hybrid annuity model. Just before I do, there was a question for Roger from earlier that I had overlooked, which was there's some interest in, Roger, if you could speak to methodological issues associated with risk and resilience analytics. Perhaps if you could share some insights on that, and then we might jump to Rajesh. Thank you.
Right. No, that's excellent. And I fully appreciated Julian's, very, very clear exposition and the need for scaling innovation, but also the challenges of even when one can state that you have benefits, that it's very difficult to get the upfront investment that is inclusive. And this is a challenge that is tied to the question you just read. We have statements about risks, whether it's from the IPCC, which myself, many others have been involved in, or we also have statements about resilience. And all of our actions cross those lines, because in dealing with the near term, it actually determines whether or not we constrain or enable future risks and vulnerability. Yet, we're told, of course, that handling the traditional risk assessment, if this is likely, then this happens, or this is the way we can respond, is actually being overwhelmed by the things all three of us were talking about, the globally networked risks. What that means in the context of methodology, of course, is while in simple risks, even complicated risks, one can say, how do you build and reinforce a building, retrofit, and all of those things, where the benefit is about $1 to $3, $6, $3 to $6 in savings. That's a risk-based approach. When you ask, where does that building live in the sense of its Wi-Fi networks, its water, its transportation hubs, and so on. We then see things like happened in Puerto Rico in 2018, in which basically the cascading risks of Hurricanes Irma and Maria basically collapsed the medical system, the Wi-Fi system, the water supply system, setting back Puerto Rico about 20 years, not just the buildings. The buildings give us the impression that we can handle risk in a linear way. The networks that support our capabilities, whether locally, and I really appreciate Julian's questions about scaling up innovation. Those networks, as mentioning in the financing arena, are global, regional, local, and subnational. Those are linked networks with different nodes of actions. That requires a resilience approach as opposed to an if-then statement. A lot of the projections we have out of the IPCC are very good for comparing and understanding emissions. When it comes to actually planning at the local level, that's where changes, variabilities, local actions take over, and the context matters a great deal. The context is the network that we live in. That latter issue is a resilience question, not a risk one.
Thank you. This is an extremely interesting point about the implication of linked networks. Very valuable for all of us. On that, I'd like to pass to Rajesh, if I may, whom I think is here from the World Bank, to share some of the experiences in the Indian context, in particular with hybrid annuity. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, Catherine. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, we can see and hear you well. Thank you, Rajesh.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and it's really fascinating to hear the discussion. I want to pick up on the few points that Julian mentioned and reflected on what we've seen in India. And this was the one relating to hybrid solutions, and the other about, while dealing with water, it's very much a local service, but how you cannot get away from issues that very much transcend the local environment or the local government, and indeed go up to the national government. And one of that relates to the poor creditworthiness of local governments, which has been a challenge in trying to bring in private finance. And that's really where, in the Indian context, the government of India, in its large program for cleaning up the river Ganga, over the last few years, has pioneered this approach where they have brought in the financing from the government of India's side in a way that backstops the local level capacity, and it in a way provides the incentive for the private sector to come in upfront with their own capital and then take up these assets for upgradation and even expansion, as well as maintenance over a 15-year period. Now, what this does is that it aligns the incentives for what the private sector is looking for in an investment in a sector where generating revenues from direct user charges has been a challenge. So there are opportunities available for mobilizing private investments, even in sectors where we see that the revenues, the tariffs are a challenge because of political economy considerations. But still, I feel there are some sweet spots like wastewater treatment, where I think the alignment of incentives is much easier to achieve, and which also has a great potential for a triple climate benefit. I mean, you can mitigate the GHG emissions, you're able to generate energy. And that's one of the things we find, that increasingly private operators are able to generate more and more energy from the wastewater treatment, and also improve the water quality in the system. So I think if we try and look at this entire space of climate finance and try and address all the issues that we see, I think the issues can seem overwhelming. But even within that, there are these sweet spots of where there is a close alignment, which can really be areas where countries can move on. And certainly the Indian experience can clearly be taken to other countries where you have similar initial conditions of a lot of wastewater that is going untreated into the river systems.
Thank you, Rajesh. It's extremely relevant in terms of identifying opportunities to overcome the challenges associated with small-scale operations, and of course, poor creditworthiness, and how we find sweet spots in that context. I think we had an earlier question. By the way, I would like to invite everybody to look through the chat. A lot of the chat, whilst not posing questions per se, provides some very interesting remarks that are worth reviewing if you have the chance. There's now a comment here from Renee Frank around whether the way forward is not almost a new PPP model, which gives the financial and insurance industries, I should say, a position as project lead manager. I don't know, Renee, if you want to explain the question orally a little further, given it's only come up, so I'm reading it literally on the spot and pose it to the panelists. Please feel free, Renee, if you're there. No, I'm not sure if Renee is able to unmute. So in that case, just to repeat again, the question is whether a way forward may not rather be a new PPP model, which gives the financial and insurance industries a position as project manager and provides an opportunity to ensure all involved stakeholders effectively get paid for services done. And develop the potential for a revenue model for the global poor, so to speak. If any of our panelists would like to speak to that comment, I'd be delighted. I think Julian might be ready, please.
Yeah, I think it's it's a question that is offering an answer. So the answer is yes. The main benefit of the PPP model is not a financing one. In particular, I mean, I know it's not the case everywhere, but in particular in a world where access to capital is a bit easier than it was in the past. We hope it will last. But the real benefit of PPP solutions is this delivery expertise in a way. So what you call here project lead management. The question is still, yes, we can develop as private operators, private developers, revenue models for the poor, but it has to be made in a constant dialogue with the public sector. I mean, the PPP model works if and only if you have a strong public sector with capacity and also a governance model that is not only an opposition where you fight about a contract for 20 years, but where you discover together the issues and you put together the right solutions. That's why I'm also pushing for solutions, hybrid solutions, where the public sector is a minority shareholder, if not a majority in some cases, of the PPP project company to ensure this alignment. But it's that being said, full support with what has been said. The new PPP model that works is a model where we have really on the private side an expertise in putting together all the stakeholders and working on the alignment. So that's yeah, on that fully agree.
If I can add something,
yes, please do.
To that, yeah. So I mean, it's always, this ties back to the risk and resilience question. I do want to keep in mind that, as Julian and everyone else knows, that when it comes to catastrophes, the public is still the insurer of last resort, and there is not really any other way around that. So, excuse me, as we saw in the California fires, we saw in Hurricane Andrew, insurers, even those tied to reinsurers with whom I and others work, do a really good job in the context of helping to pay, treat their premiums as things that help reduce and induce people to act in their own benefit. However, I will say that the social construction of risk that produces catastrophe is not simply amenable to PPP, right? Managing resources, scaling up and innovation is actually really important, but unless we are crafting public-private partnerships that have a strong civil society component, then we do not have equity as the front and center question. So we have to decide if that's what we want. So from that standpoint, I would like to keep in mind that from a risk-based standpoint, the public-private partnerships are excellent and they help us manage risks, and we've learned ways to do that in the near term. When it comes, as I was mentioning, all the data that we're using, people like Jean Leroux-Bear and others have shown that when it comes to nature-based solutions for long-term investments, there are not really good long-standing public-private partnerships. We have a few pointed to in the report, but I do want to keep in mind, and this brings back the other panelists in a sense, is that it is public, private, and civil society. It's the communities that hold the issues of equity front and center. And I'd like to make sure we're keeping that in mind. I know Julian has talked about this before. I just want to make sure that we're not seeing catastrophic risk as the same as managing probabilistic risk.
Thank you. I think that's extremely useful in this context. I want to ask a question about trade-offs. What would be your suggestion? We can't always assume that there's a perfect synergy. How do we address potential trade-offs between climate and water security in some cases? I don't know if Kate might want to come in here.
Oh, happy to, Ingrid. I think the first step on all of this is at least being aware that there are trade-offs. We're having multiple conversations with many of the corporations at CDP, and I'm talking here with my CDP hat on, which for those of you on the call that may not know who CDP is, we're an international not-for-profit organisation working to mobilise the private sector, both large consumers of water as well as their financial institutions to act. So we use a questionnaire and the power of transparency ultimately to change their behaviour so that they begin to grow differently and reduce their impacts on water. We ask a very simple question on the face of it about trade-offs between water and climate and whether they, what steps they're taking to mitigate these, whether they've been confronted with them. And when we first introduced the question, we have over 3,500 companies now disclosing. Most of them were not even aware that those types of trade-offs existed. And it was only through prompting them to consider this that they suddenly became aware of the fact that they were having to consume more energy to treat wastewater, for example, and yet the ultimate process to eliminate pollution is essential, but that it is coming at the cost of achieving their carbon ambitions or their zero carbon ambitions. But that moment of awakening, again, I used that word earlier, was a vital moment in behavior changing of these institutions, because they then came to the realization they were going to have to take different tactics in order to achieve the same outcome. But you're right in identifying the fact that there generally will never be one solution that is impact free, and the first stage to managing those is awareness of that, and then ultimately managing or putting steps in place to manage and reduce the trade-offs wherever possible. But let's not also forget that there are many mutual benefits from certain activities as well. But Julian may have ultimately also more to add to this.
If not, I'm going to, I want to be a good student as a moderator of a Zoom meeting and finish on time so that you can get your break. So I'm going to pose 3 questions that came out in the chat to the 3 of you and let you decide which to answer in a last 1 minute. Instead of summing up, Kathleen, I'd rather that the participants hear from our 3 excellent speakers. So here are the 3 questions, and I'll let the 3 of you decide, Roger, Julian and Kate, which to answer in 1 minute. The first question is a very long one from Arthur. So Arthur Wood, I challenge you all to read it and to understand the maths, but I'm going to put it down effectively into one question, a short sentence. I mean, but what is the value of, how can systems collaboration help us to find ways to incentivize small scale innovation? In other words, you do all the maths and sometimes it just doesn't add up. And could a systems approach help us in that context? The second question from Alex Maloney is what is your view, the panelists, of engaging corporates, such as Danone, who I believe are on the call, more in funding outcomes-based water infrastructure investments? And the last one is from Guy Alerts, which is water in the future, more, and this is perhaps to Roger, but I welcome comments from any of the 3, more complex, more uncertain, more rapid change. There was a mention from Roger of the need for knowledge within our administrations and society to prepare for adaptive management. We can't all be as expert as Roger and our panelists today. So what kind of knowledge and learning do we need? And would that be the same for a rich country like the US as compared with a poor one, so to speak? Those are the last 3 questions. For all the other excellent comments and questions, I invite you to review the chat. And now over to Roger, then Julian, then Kate for last remarks. Thanks.
What an exciting list of questions there. So I'll take the last one, work back up, and be hopefully very, very quick about this and leave all disagreements to Kate and Julie. So From this standpoint, I think there's a really rich point about the nature of knowledge and who helps us learn. And the type of knowledge I'm talking about is not simply, it's not technical by itself. We have a lot of that. The issue is knowledge about what enables people to make choices and act about their own lives, and what enables them to act in the face of structural and systemic risk. That's the kind of knowledge I'm talking about, the awareness and transparency of risk, but also the accessibility of opportunities in the way Julian was just describing them. What you need in those settings, and we've tried to set up some of these, are robust regional networks that work with people on clarifying the risk, who is acting on whose behalf, and why others see some of the issues the way you do. This is an increasingly polarized world. One of my favorite I.F. Stone philosophical lines was, don't commit the Socratic fallacy. The Socratic fallacy is, if we are to agree on the mechanics of walking before we take a walk, we will never take a walk. And there's a lot of good psychological work on the siting of nuclear plants and so on that shows if you, even when you estimate the risk, that's the same number together, we have different views about how we should act, both for and against siting. So the types of knowledge actually is about shared values, is about shared partnerships, and what makes us work together. We are, as Harold Lasswell said years ago, we are different psychologically, but yet we agree on law and ways of collaboration. And that's the knowledge I'm talking about. Who helps foster that is the knowledge transition needs a whole new set of folks that actually see that as the thing they do.
Thank you, Roger.
Just in the interest of time, I'll...
Thank you, and thanks very much for your participation today. Kate.
Thank you, Ingrid. I'll take the question from Alex on corporates, and I know Alex well, and will be no surprise to him that I am clearly an advocate for crowding in private sector corporate finance in this way. I mentioned earlier that water can float a boat, but it can sink it also, and the companies that CDP is engaging are aware of the fact that fundamentally, to achieve the water security outcome, the resilience that they're looking for as industries, they need to invest in the resilience of the river basins that they are responsible for and operating within. And without that type of investment, without those types of actions, that they can ultimately end up being a clean fish in a dirty pond and still facing the same level of risk or negative impact that they were experiencing in the first place. There's a mutually beneficial opportunity. I think what we need now is the system, the infrastructure, or the architecture for us to guide companies in that direction. Just last year, companies disclosed that water-related risks could pose put about $300 billion worth of financial value at risk. But at the same time, the same group of companies disclosed that to mitigate the risk, it would cost them just $55 billion. That's 5 times less at the cost of action versus inaction. And they're already looking to make these strategic investments. So if we as a collective can harness those and guide them towards investments that benefit not only themselves, but the broader community that surrounds them, such as water infrastructure investment, then the better off we will all be.
Wow, thank you, Kate. Finally, Julian, for you to finish in the last minute.
I was on mute. I've made a mistake to go through the list of all questions, and I don't know which one to pick. So, I mean, on this, I think we've seen in particular how important is the dimension of governance in that specific sector. I think, yes, there is a question about technology, and I'm a big technology supporter, and I think a lot can be done with new tools to increase the efficiency of the service and increase its affordability and addressing the challenges. But at the end of the day, if you have a misalignment between the various levels of public authorities, a poor engagement with the stakeholders, if you have a private sector coming with expertise in an arrogant way without adapting to the local context and listening to the actual needs, at the end of the day, nothing will work. So I know it's something that you may have heard zillions of times, but for instance, if we take the example of involving corporates, at a river basin level, it raises the question of who pays for what at this level, and it goes with legal systems, it goes with regulations, local regulations. So I think it's a sector that is very much impacted by how we design the way we manage commons, And at the end of the day, we just have to remember one thing, is that finance is just an outcome. It's an important way to deliver something, but if you have a poor governance in place, nothing will come out of it. So anyway, that's just a comment. I had a concrete example coming from an OECD sponsored project in France that has been delivered eventually thanks to the OECD, I have to say it, which was an infrastructure against flooding. And I went through a very interesting journey about insurance of flooding events. But anyway, we don't have time here, but I just wanted to say that I've seen with this concrete example that thinking on the benefits of a project, making sure that people understand what it is contributing, which is typically what the OECD does, is at the end of the day making a difference, because at the end of the day, people realize at the very top of the government that it was a key project to promote, and it was delivered. Some of you in the room may know it. It's La Bassée, which is it's an infrastructure that is there to manage the flooding of the Seine in case of extreme events. And this is something that is happening because people at some point looked at it from an economic perspective and were able to explain what schemes could emerge. So words matter, in other words.
Thank you for that, Julian, and a sincere thanks to Roger, to Kate, and to Julian for opening up the roundtable so well. The degree of comments in the chat indicates the engagement in your remarks, so thank you. So to close, this session has really brought home the fact that water and climate are inextricably linked, and at the same time the complex compounding and cascading risks in a way require a resilience approach. We've begun to touch on some of the distinct challenges related to financing water, be they small scale, the issues of scale, issues of creditworthiness and so forth. And at the same time, we see that financing models can be adapted to those challenges, including some of the examples given here, and that there are huge potential gains if we can inspire action. That's a natural segue, I think, a natural link into the next session. I'm 3 minutes over, so I hope I'm not in too much trouble with Kathleen. Everybody deserves a break. Great thanks to the US State Department, to our speakers, and also a word of thanks to Kathleen and the OECD team quietly working behind the scenes. With that, back to Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for that skillful sharing through complex topics. Indeed, now it's time for us to take a 10-minute break. We will have a second session talking about practical and inspiring examples. We have an equally stimulating panel, so I really encourage you to come back in 10 minutes. But please, for now, turn your screens off, go make a cup of tea or coffee, walk around, get some fresh air, and see you back here in a few minutes. We'll start again at 10 past the hour. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. That was indeed a very short break, but I'm glad that many of you are still connected. I see we have our esteemed chair for this next session connected and ready to go. So really appreciate you being with us today, Andy. Let me just briefly introduce you before I turn the floor over to you. Many of you probably already know Andy, but Andy Roby is the Senior Water Security Advisor to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO, since June of 2019. He has held positions as a policy advisor for the Department for International Development in London, as a strategy lead and policy advisor for UK's Department for International Trade, and also as a senior forestry advisor for UK Aid in Jakarta. He's worked extensively on forestry throughout his career, notably for the European Commission and the Natural Resources Institute. Andy, we're really pleased to have you with us today. So I'm going to hand the floor over to you and let you introduce the next session. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Kathleen, and a great honor to be here. I don't think I'm going to live up to this billing, but I'll do my best. Yeah, a great segue from Ingrid just now. Risk requires resilience, and that's the challenge that we're going to pick up in practice with these 5. I hope now we have all our 5 speakers with us speaking about practical examples of how to do this water finance business. So this section is water as a lever for climate action, the investment opportunity. And it's great to be positively framed like this. There is opportunity in investment on climate action. And as COP26 presidents, I have to say a few things about COP, because as my big boss, Prime Minister Boris, said yesterday, this is a turning point for humanity. And we have 4 objectives as the UK presidency: mitigation, of course, adaptation, partnership, but also finance. And with that, 2 cross-cutting themes, amongst others, nature and inclusiveness. And on mitigation, we're very clear: 1.5 degrees, net zero. That's very clear, and many are going in that direction now. But we don't have a similar clear direction for adaptation. We don't yet have a clear global adaptation goal. So we don't really know what resilience looks like, and that is homework, to be honest. On finance, we're going for $100 billion as per Paris, but with the pandemic, that's not been possible at 2020. But we are grateful to the US for doubling its climate finance offer yesterday at UNGA, and we hope that will encourage others. But finally, on partnership, no one country, no one organization or company can tackle this climate emergency. We are in the same boat, and we need to row together in the same direction. The same applies to water. I think there are a lot of parallels there. And I think when we do get cooperation between sectors and stakeholders, then the finance conditions become a lot more attractive. And just to bring you back to IPCC 6, the latest report from the scientists, and how that relates to what we're doing in the FCDO, they gave 4 priorities for climate change action. And I think we can relate to these in the water sector. Policy coherence and institutional collaboration, absolutely key, from the top. And to support this, we've been funding AGWA to develop a water tracker to help countries prioritize and work together across their sectors. Secondly, we need climate smart tech, the practices, the good advice, the best practice. And we're planning on launching a water hub next year to help countries do that in the FCDO. Thirdly, empowerment and inclusiveness is critical. And for that, we're launching the Footprint Initiative, Fair Water Footprints, at COP26, which is about driving change through civil society and business. And then finally, the 4th priority from IPCC, and it's interesting that they put this 4th, finance. And this is to support low emissions and resilient supply chains. And for that, we're working with WaterAid on the Resilient Water Accelerator, hoping to bring in CDC, our investment bank, PIDGE, and some other levers. So I'm sure our speakers will take up some of these issues in due course. So you've heard enough from me. Let's get on to some practical examples of water investment and hear from the 5 practitioners. I think, Ger, you're with us now. We've got Ger Bergkamp, Hubert Jenny, Ella Lazat, Todd Gartner, and Dr. Yonggyok Cho. I hope I got the pronunciation right. You've each got 5 minutes, and I will be running a stopwatch and give you a 1-minute warning, because this is a packed agenda and we want to hear from everybody. We also want enough time for discussion at the end. So as before, please, participants, pose your questions or comments, put your hand up during discussions. Don't forget there is a website where you can post material. And I'm not going to go through the long bios because we've got such great CVs here. And I'm just going to start straight away with Ger and invite you to give us 5 minutes. Ger Bergkamp is the Head of Business Development at Climate Fund Managers. Over to you, Ger.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. What I will do is briefly talk about what Climate Fund Manager does and Climate Investor 2 is, and then a little bit of our lessons learned over the last 18 months. Climate Fund Manager is a fund manager. We manage investment funds focused on climate, surprisingly. We combine blended finance with climate impact and attractive returns. So the combination of those 3 makes who we are. So in all our actions, climate, call it climate happiness, either on mitigation or adaptation is key. We focus in our second fund, Climate Investor 2, we focus on investments in the water sector, in sanitation, and in oceans related activities. So anything that basically is infrastructure. So we do project finance related to infrastructure, so anything from a water supply plant to a wastewater plant to a desalination plant, piping, pumping, all those things we can invest in. We also can invest in natural infrastructure, although as you probably imagine that it's a little bit harder to structure and organize these. As said, we focus on climate mitigation and adaptation. So all our investments need to have a real marker too for mitigation or adaptation. And so we always see, oh, wastewater treatment plant, there is a reuse. Oh, that's great. This is an area that is affected by climate change. And that actually could then actually score for a real marker too for adaptation, as an example. So we really screen those potential transactions on whether they actually have a climate dimension in it. And if they don't come through. We basically have 3 sub-funds. So it's the Climate Investor 2 is one fund, but it has got one part is development. So we can invest in the development of projects. And then once they are developed, they reach financial close. The second fund, the Construction Equity Fund, de facto buys the project together with other investors, basically then refunds the development fund and actually finances the construction of the building. And once it's built and operated, then we have a refinancing fund that actually brings in the debt financing to then enable for the equity that we have put into the project to be repurposed and invested in another project. So we invest our ticket size at the moment for the main investments is between 10 and 20 million. After sort of like early next year, we will be between 50 and 150 million equity investment, and we can finance up to 75% of a project. We don't have to, but we can. What we see now over the last 12, 18 months of developing, we've got quite a few lessons learned, and this 5 minutes is a bit too short, but I can provide a few that are relevant for what I could say blended finance for climate. First of all, on the capital raising side, so as we understand in a fund, you need to get money in from investors, and you need to spend money on the other side. So the first lesson learned is that the market is very much interested, particularly the institutional investors, in the water sector and to invest in classic infrastructure projects in the water sector. Both that is so for the guaranteed tranche, but also for the fully commercial tranche in our investments. So that's very positive. What we also see is that there is a significant opportunity for concessional finance, the other part of the blended finance, to actually leverage then those institutional investments in water. We would probably like to see a higher uptake of that opportunity. We think that actually might be a case. But there is definitely also an interest to participate in that. We also see that so far we have been quite successful in actually mobilizing capital. So we will have our first financial close before the end of the year, and we will be somewhere between 200 and 400 million in that first close. A final close probably within 18, 24 months after that, and we're aiming somewhere between 600 and 1 billion to be in the fund at financial close. It's a 20-year closed fund, and so we will probably recycle the principal at least one time. So we invest and then we refinance and then we can reinvest again. Now on the other side of the spectrum, of course, where we're spending the money, we see that the first part of the fund, the development fund financing, is very attractive for a lot of developers. It basically is capital that is put at risk to develop a project. And of course, if the project is successful and reaches financial close, that part of the development finance is repaid with a premium. And of course, then the development fund can reinvest that in developing the next project. We also see that we can often do what we call pilot projects. So if we don't have certainty about the technology or the commercial application in a certain case, we can actually establish and finance pilots, which actually help us to understand both the technology, the use of the technology, but also the commercial dimension of the project, which is often probably the biggest challenge. Secondly, it is possible to develop a proper pipeline that is investable in the water sector in emerging economies. We currently have between 25 and 30 transactions actively under development, and we see there's a lot of opportunity to do more. It's just you can only do so much in 24 hours. Also, we see, however, that we always need developers, commercial developers that develop projects. Similar to when you want to build a shopping mall, you need a developer that actually goes out and said, yep, I'm going to build a shopping mall. Well, similar, you need in the water sector developers that say, yep, I'm going to actually build a water plant. Now, we see that a lot of the developers that are often EPC contractors are familiar with that game, the EPC contractors, or responding to government tenders and then having a contract. Very few have actually the knowledge and know-how how to actually develop a privately financed water project. And we see that we need to do quite a bit of listening.
Start wrapping up. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And then we see also with government, there's a growing interest in this, but there's a lack of PPP capacity in the administration. There's also a lack of often government guarantees or other forms that can be used, and quite a high market risk. And last but not least, we see there's a growing competition for certain markets and certain type of projects where there is capital coming into the water sector with very low demands on returns. And you see that, for example, with Gulf money going to desal and water reuse projects in Africa. So a quick overview and some experiences from Climate Investor 2 from the last 12 months of working. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was really a great overview and very encouraging. Without any more to do, let me now introduce Hubert Jenny, who is from the Green Climate Fund's Water Security. You're a senior infrastructure specialist at the GCF, and you're going to give us 5 minutes, if you can, sir, on water security sectoral guidelines. Over to you, Hubert. You might still be on mute, Hubert.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me? All good? Okay. So as a transition, I will say that I'm part of the Green Climate Fund project team looking at the Climate Investor 2. So we really look forward to this project after the success of Climate Investor 1. So just, short introduction. I'm not sure the Green Climate Fund need introduction, but it's the world's largest climate fund and a critical element of the Paris Agreement. It has been mandated to support developing countries to raise and realize their nationally determined contribution, NDC, and national adaptation plan toward climate resilience and biodiversity. So thematically, water is a human right, and it's supported by integrated water resource management, which is at the core of the SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. And this SDG is under strong pressure from climate change. So what we're trying is cross-referencing the target of SDG 6 with SDG 13 on climate action. And we show that water security supports fast-tracking climate investment into what we call transformational water and sanitation project with two interlinked paradigm shifting pathway. And those will be at the core of the upcoming GCF water security sectoral guideline. The first pathway look mostly at mitigation. It's called enhanced water conservation, water efficiency, and water reuse. And what we try to do is compel water demand management and competitive water use, enhancing water efficiency for example, non-revenue water reduction, water reuse and recycling, more efficient irrigation, and something that is new, distributed water and sanitation management, rather than those big centralized water supply and sanitation system. And we add entirely to the concept of climate smart utilities that was developed by the International Water Association. The second pathway deals mostly with adaptation and is basically about strengthening integrated water resource management. So we are basically climate proofing water infrastructure, promoting preservation of water at each step of the water cycle, and try to maximize technology, institutional and financial innovation, and support circular economy principle. We don't use nature-based solution anymore, but we replace this by ecosystem-based management. So these specifically include preservation of water resource, water supply from new sources, and protection from water-related hazards. In the context of climate change, one big innovation is to explore the non-conventional use of water. For example, wastewater as a new asset class through water reuse and water recycling. In some regions, wastewater is already a common water source. Singapore, for example, for good reason. But in some areas, there is still barrier for wider adoption because of safety guideline and governance issue. GCF co-finance project in Palestine and in Jordan on water reuse, but those projects are short of true engagement with the private sector, which is basically the name of the game. We have a project in South Africa called developed by the Development Bank of South Africa under consideration. It's a national water reuse program to create a new water asset class in water reuse and using credit enhancement and hopefully get the private sector interested to crowding in funding. And this is targeted toward developing debt capital market in line with the program ESG impact. The GCF will provide, after approval, credit enhancement via subordinate facility and tenor extension. So at the moment, we are receiving many funding requests on climate resilience, mostly from vulnerable community on community development projects, because water scarcity affects their livelihood and basically result in a rural-urban migration. And this is literally transforming the socioeconomic fabric of traditional community and really put pressure on urban center as a direct result of climate change. Climate change impact increased water scarcity, and we have numbers that show that population under water stress is expected to rise by 50% by 2050 to about 3 billion. And the number of people at risk from flood will increase from 1.2 to 1.6 billion over the same period. So the impact of climate change on the availability of water resource over space and time affect the vulnerable people disproportionately. There is deterioration of water quality because of lack of water resource and increased salinity in groundwater source. One of the big problems we have in this type of project is what we call maladaptation. Basically, is the project going to make the situation in terms of water scarcity worse or better? So this is something we look very carefully at. And many of the poor depend on agriculture to sustain their livelihood. And this in turn is dependent on adequate water supply, whether it's rain-fed or irrigation, and both are impacted by climate change. I just want to say—
Can you start to wrap up? Sorry, we're out of time.
No, it's nearly finished. What we have is 18 projects, which correspond to 10% of our portfolio for about $1.5 billion. And WASH program represents 50% of the funding allocation. There is a good distribution over the 5 continents, except Europe, most probably because EU is deeply involved, and private sector is non-existent. 100% of the project funded are public. And 83% of the project are classified as adaptation and 17% cross-cutting. So with not enough public funding available for water and sanitation and limited private sector financing enabled, GCF and also the other international financing institution are basically looking at doing demonstration projects with very strong scaling up and replication potential. Thank you very much.
Oh, merci Hubert, ça c'est fantastique. Lots and lots to chew on there, but let's not hang around because we've got 3 more speakers and we'd like to hear from them. Please post your questions in the chat. I see a few are coming up. That's brilliant. Can I now call upon Ella Lazat to speak? This is about USAID's commitment to make climate resilient investments in the water sector with examples from your global portfolio in the Philippines, Kenya, and South Africa. Over to you, Ella. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's exciting to be here among a group of esteemed panelists. I'm actually here looking forward to what others have to say, just my fellow panelists and participants, and get some additional ideas on how to strengthen our work at USAID and also in the broader USG, and how we can better execute against our commitments, which Andrew actually talked about earlier in terms of President Biden's UNGA speech this week, basically committing to working with Congress to double the amount of climate finance, including significant increases in adaptation. And we hope that with these increases and also working with other development partners, both public and private, we'll be able to meet the goal of mobilizing $100 billion to support climate action in developing nations. And that's commitment at the broader level. At the agency level within USAID, we are in the process of developing the agency climate strategy, as well as a climate finance action plan to go with it. And really looking at working with vulnerable countries. I think that was mentioned here in some of the panelists and also the IPCC report. Let's not forget about the more vulnerable communities and more vulnerable countries that don't always get the funding. And then zeroing into the water sector where I work, we are committed to actually ensuring that all of our water directive funds, that's just a fancy term for what US Congress gives us to program and what we do globally. And we're committed to ensuring that those funds will consider how to tangibly support climate change adaptation or mitigation in the water and sanitation sectors. So that doesn't really mean that we're not doing this already. We haven't done it before. We've had lots of good successful examples of non-revenue water that was already mentioned before as one activity. Demand side management, very important. But how do we do that given that we're scaling up our commitments, scaling up funding? And so let me just take you on a little trip around the world. This will be the fastest international trip you'll ever take during COVID. And so first stop, Cape Town, depending on where you are, this could take a while. So closing the financing gaps. And in 2017, severe water shortages in Cape Town threatened to bring a day zero. And that was going to be the day when the city's reservoirs would run out of water. So during the crisis and post-drought recovery, USAID helped the city's water and sanitation department, led by Mike Webster, an old colleague of mine at the World Bank, actually, to improve revenue collection through a customer turnaround project. Now, that doesn't seem very sexy, does it? Customer turnaround? Well, it turns out that actually reforming just one aspect of your water utility can generate a ton of additional revenue. We expect to generate more than $25 million in additional revenue. And that's really just mobilizing, maximizing what the existing funding is and mobilizing resources from user fees and public funds. So this is only a piece of the puzzle of the Cape Town story. Contact Mike if you want more of it in terms of what they were thinking about water, how they're adapting, how they changed and broadened and diversified their water sources. And then now let's fly out of Cape Town and go to Mozambique, Maputo, where we're currently working with small private water providers. There are 2,000 of them serving almost 2 million people throughout the country, and help them reduce their electricity costs through increased solar energy use. That's one of the things I know that some of the panelists have talked about in terms of really thinking about energy efficiency. in some case, I think it was mentioned that it's 20% of the cost. It's actually 50, 60% for a lot of these small providers of a water utility running costs for these small decentralized schemes. So how can we work with them to reduce these costs and actually improve resiliency? And we're doing similar work in Zambia, but since I only have a couple minutes, let's leave that and go to Asia. Go from Maputo to Joburg to Dubai and to Manila, where we're working with the Philippine government on water security planning. And again, you're thinking, this sounds dry, boring, and possibly non-transformational, right? Gerd talked about Climate Investor 2, very exciting piece of work, GCF. We're just talking straight up planning. Why? Well, because in a country so vulnerable to climate impacts and drought, intense rainfall, typhoons, I lived with that. I was a child growing up in the Philippines and I had to deal with that. And now I have to deal with it all calls to my family, making sure they're okay. And the island where I'm probably from will disappear or partially disappear in the future. So it is very personal for me in terms of addressing climate change and water. And what we're doing there is because the country and many communities are already dealing with this and have been dealing with this for years or for decades, we are going back to planning. It's really important to improve resiliency, not just to climate, but also COVID, to think about water security planning and work with decision makers at the local governments. I think it was mentioned before that water is really a local issue. So there's that local and national. So we're working at the provincial level, provincial action plan. And the proof is still in the pudding. So I don't have the results for you because it's in the process, but we hope to scale that up from that pioneering approach and deal with some political economy issues. But it will get us to what are the investment costs needed? What are the behaviors needed to change to actually achieve the goals? And so I was about to take you to Latin America, but I know that Andrew will say,
time is really up.
You gotta stop. So my time is up. And
bring
so
it in during the Q&A if you like.
Thank
that was
you.
a great global tour. Thank you so much. And having lived in Southeast Asia, I sympathize with the Philippines dilemma. It's a region that's really turbulent. Let's jump very quickly now to speaker number 4, my friend Todd. How are you doing, Todd? Good to see you. Let's hear from you, WRI, Director of the Cities for Forests Initiative, and we've got Forest Resilient Bonds, which is back to my roots. Over to you, Todd. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Andy, and pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I have the honor of directing Cities for Forests at the World Resources Institute, where influential cities, utilities, and mayors from Glasgow to Sao Paulo, Jakarta to San Francisco have joined a network of 70 plus other cities committed to conserving and restoring forests and green infrastructure within their cities and nearby watersheds. And what all of these cities are asking for is financial innovation to address their most pressing environmental challenges. And as a majority of you know, wildfire in the Western US is one of those big immediate challenges. You've probably seen it in the media, and if you live out west like me, you've likely experienced the impacts firsthand. Dealing with boil water advisories, being forced to evacuate the approaching flames, and needing to run your air purifier nonstop with smoky skies and toxic air quality. Unfortunately, if the trends continue like we've seen over the last couple of decades, the size and severity of these wildfires across the US is only going to increase. We've experienced 9 of the 10 worst wildfire seasons on record since 2000. 2017 was the most expensive fire season, and unfortunately, 2018 was the deadliest. Since July of this year, so 3 months ago, we've had 7,300 fires burn across the West, burning well over 2 million acres. So that's bigger than the Grand Canyon. And all of this has major implications on the water supply for the Western US. Heavy pollutants impacting the water quality, loss of reservoir capacity from sediment loading, and treatment and distribution systems that are being destroyed. Not an ideal situation when 89% of the West is currently in drought conditions. So how did we get here? This crisis is upon us and getting worse. Well, it started with decades of forest management that suppressed wildfire at all costs. So that led to our forests becoming really overgrown and unhealthy. And this overgrowth, when combined with climate change and increasingly hotter and drier reality, has created a tinderbox of conditions across the Western US. But there is a proven solution, right? So it's not all doom and gloom to reducing wildfire and protecting our water resources. Forest restoration, nature-based solutions, treatments like forest thinning, removing the dead and excess vegetation that serves as fuel for these large fires, prescribed burning to reinvigorate a healthy and resilient system. So if we know what the problem is and we have an identified solution, why is the crisis getting dramatically worse each year? And the simple answer, and this is what brings us to the finance piece, is it's lack of funds to implement forest restoration at the scale that matches the need. And so the US Forest Service, the primary agency who deals with fire, they're stuck in a vicious cycle where they're forced to pay to put out today's fires with funds that were oriented to deal with the prevention of tomorrow's fires. And to give you a sense of what that means in terms of scale, money towards fire suppression, so putting out fires, in 1995, it was 15% of the US Forest Service budget. Current day, it is nearly 60%. So 60% of the money oriented to manage the land is purely spent on fighting fires. Right now, we're looking at a $100 billion backlog of restoration needs. Under the current pace, it'll take us well over 200 years to get ahead of this issue. And that's obviously a scary stat, but it's also an opportunity and what gives our team and partners a lot of hope, because it's not a science problem, it's a finance problem. And WRI, with our lead development partner, Blue Forest, and our wonderful partners at the US Forest Service, we have developed a finance solution and it is working. The Forest Resilience Bond. It's a public-private partnership that enables private capital from groups like insurers and pension plans to invest in restoration at scale. Simply put, the Forest Resilience Bond raises capital from private investors through a special purpose vehicle to fund the full cost of restoration projects upfront to get the work done now and reduce the risk. Then stakeholders downstream, water and hydroelectric utilities, state agencies, water-dependent companies, share the cost of reimbursing those investors, so principal plus interest, based on the benefits they receive. This kind of fits into that pay for performance, pay for impact that was brought up in one of the previous discussions. Ultimately, all parties that are involved in the Forest Resilience Bond benefit. Investors are receiving an acceptable return, both concessionary and market-based investors. Downstream stakeholders are seeing a substantial reduction in risks, and in some cases, actually revenue generation from additional water availability in terms of revenue, reservoir capacity, and protection of the resources. And there's better air quality, cleaner water, reduced emissions, job creation, and protection of lives and infrastructure for the general public. Public and philanthropic dollars are not going to get us there when we're talking about a $100 billion backlog, but private sector can be an important leverage and solution to this issue. It's a faster route for forest health, ultimately to lead to resilient outcomes. About 2 years ago, we launched our first Forest Resilience Bond on the Tahoe National Forest. That covered 15,000 acres of restoration, and we financed that with just over $4 million of private capital. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to be launching our second FRB, 48,000 acres of restoration financed with over $25 million of private capital. We've been able to
time. Sorry.
No, perfect. The last thing I'll say is we are oversubscribed. And we've been able to turn this from restoration as a cost to restoration as a benefit. Thanks so much.
I was just about to cut you off and you cut yourself off. Thank you so much, Todd. It was great to hear more about forests, having suffered forest fires in Indonesia for far too many years. And there's a lot we can learn from that, I'm sure, in the water sector. Let's finish with our last speaker. I'd like to welcome Dr. Yongdeok Cho to talk about the financing experience of the Tina River Hydropower project in the Solomons. Please, Dr. Yongdeok Cho, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. My name is Yongdeok Cho from the Asia Water Council and K-Water. Catherine, could you share the PPT file?
Oh, yes. I think Ines is going to launch that now. All right,
Okay.
There you go. Do you see that?
Yeah, I can see that. I'm going to explain the Solomon Tina River hydropower project, and that is invested by the GCF and ADA, the ADB, and many the MDB to participate for that project. Next, please. Okay, the Solomon Island is located near the Australia area, and as you can see, around the 97% diesel generated. They use the diesel engine, and also only 9% of the population is connected to the grid. It's very low the percentage, and also that is a small island developing states, and like the other country, the rapidly growing population and higher vulnerability to climate change, especially for the sinking to the ocean, and also susceptibility to natural disaster. And the Tina hydropower has three purposes. The first one is developing clean energy instead of using diesel. And the second, contributing economic development, and lastly, climate change measures. And the Tina hydropower, the plant is located. The project location is in the Tina River, and around 20 kilometer, 20 kilometer east part from the Honiara, the capital of Solomon Island. And the working scope is dam and accessing load construction, ONM, and TA. And next page. Next page, please. Okay. There are three important things when we start this project. The first one is shifted from diesel to renewable energy. The second, reduce electricity tariff, and lastly, the reduce the greenhouse gas emission in a power system. In the first part, currently the Solomon 97% diesel generated system, and we can using the renewable energy, the kind of hydropower that will be alternative to diesel generation. And secondly, reduce electricity tariff. As you know, the average electricity tariff in Pacific area around 40 cents per kilowatt, but in Solomon, currently they pay the 64 cents per kilowatt. However, that one decreasing cost to 70.8 cent per the kilowatt hour, and also that facility has power 15 megawatt hydropower is emission reduction of 49,500 ton. Next page. And this is kind of developing process. And first of all, firstly institutional the building they have, and the investment and the PPP preparation, the 2011 bidding process they have, and they got an EOI submission, and also during the project formulation, they developing the feasibility study and the pre-qualification passed. And then next year, 2015, they got a proposal submission, and the K-Water and the Hyundai Engineering submit the proposal, and the K-Water and the Hyundai ENG got that proposal, got that project. And the next year, the project approval, funding approval from GCF, World Bank, ADB, EDCF, and finalizing the funding IA. We finished the IA, PPA, and NTP, and also we got an EPC contract and project kickoff. And right now we are starting the project, and currently we are doing the access load, and until end of this year, we're gonna starting dam and hydropower facility kickoff. And that project is going to finish in 2024 September. And as you can see in this below table, and IDA, GCF, ADB, EDCF, and ADFD, and GOA, APIP, they got a fund, and we have multilateral development bank funded. There are a lot of variety funded we got, therefore decrease risk burden. Next page. Okay, there are around four significant outcomes. The first one is the building resilience for the SIDS throughout the GCF resources allocation for the vulnerable country. Like this is best practice. Could be a best practice implement climate change measures for specifically SIDS. And the second one is achieving global agenda such as SDG together, and also the increasing the impact of ODA funding, and to graduate from the category of LDC, and as well as building capacity. And also the most important part is we need to understand the current status, like a Solomon economic situation and the residents' awareness. That is going to be we work so hard. How we gonna help, and how we gonna develop, how we gonna defend the climate change. Lastly, as I listened, the many the panelists mentioned that we're using the blended finance, like I mentioned, the many agencies MDB participated, and during in order to get the financial closing, I think the important thing is persuading is really important. But the World Bank supported that project, and the World Bank initiated those projects, and also the IFC, the advisory, the working. I think that is really important, and also the K-Water and Hyundai ENG working very closely with the Solomon government. I think that is good chance to making some good project with GCF and ADB and the other agencies. And that is the kind of introduction of the Solomon Tina Power project, and as well as Asia Water Council and K-Water working very hard to develop climate change project, specifically with the UNDP and also that is Mekong River the flood control project. In addition, these days we work we making a project with the USAID, the Thailand branch, and I think there's going to be a better initiative process. However, I convinced that we can make some great outcome in order to make some great climate change adaptation and mitigation project with all agencies. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Young-Bok. That's a great way to end with a small island developing state. So important for the whole loss and damage debate as we go into COP26 and bringing those SDGs together and blending the finance. So thank you for that very, very quick rush through. Some great speakers. I'm not going to attempt to summarize all that was said. You've heard it, but we've got a few questions in the chat that have come up, and I see Bill's hand is up. Please, I'll run from the top down with a few questions here. Let's see. Oh, I can't see them. No, they haven't come through. I beg your pardon. Let's. I think Nat, you had a question. I'm going to ask if I can find it. I've lost it now. Oh yeah, there's two questions here from Nat. the use of carbon sinks under the mitigation pathway, are they included in water or other guidelines? So this is one for Hubert, I think. Is that right, Hubert? Can you come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, no, I just made a comment on nature-based solution that, you know, it's a question of semantic, and it doesn't matter how we call it. Constructed wetland are critical to ecosystem-based management or ecosystem-based approach, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and are well considered under both the water security sectoral guideline as well as the ecosystem and service sectoral guideline of the Green Climate Fund. And both under preparation, and timing will be, we target consultation, public consultation before the end of the year, and publishing in the first quarter of next year. The agriculture and the urban sectoral guideline are already published. Thank you.
Hubert, thank you very much. But let's go to Bill, who had his hand up whilst I sort out some more questions. Bill, can you come in with your question?
It's more an observation, really, Andrew, but you know, in all these discussions, and I was particularly interested in the WRI bond issue, you know, the challenge that we face in developing countries that maybe have been discussed, I haven't heard it, is the issue of mismatch between revenue streams and debt service streams. And, you know, we all talk about the trillions of dollars just waiting to be invested. But if we want the private sector to invest in developing countries, the challenge has always been there of how to deal with the foreign exchange risk. And so it's great to hear about what's happening in the US. But, you know, is WRI thinking of a model which could address this foreign exchange mismatch? Because I think without that, we've got to look then to local sources of finance, domestic finance, and then who to bring in to provide that finance. Like in Vietnam, I worked for many years, very strong on, you know, life insurance policies and pension funds. Those are the kind of people who need a long-term and stable revenue stream from their investments. And in that respect, water must be one of the best bets for them. So I think, you know, we need to consider how we actually get to mobilize this domestic finance. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Todd,
Andy, can I jump in and just? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a spot on observation, right? I mean, in the US and Europe with creditworthiness and with clear governance, sort of understanding the contracted cash flows and how these deals would work is much more obvious than in ODA locations. You know, that being said, we're working really closely, especially with the IDB and the World Bank, thinking specifically how we contextualize this to the developing and emerging world context. So looking at resilience bonds, looking at green bonds, insurance products, how can they be viable with some of the constraints that you mentioned? You know, actually saw a comment from Monica about sort of blended finance, and I think that's part of the answer. How can development assistance sort of buy down some of the risk and make this a slightly less risky proposition for the private sector? We're also just going to have to take chances. One of the previous speakers said, you know, if you try to figure out all the mechanics of walking before you take the walk, you'll never get there. We're just going to have to try to take some chances and see what it looks like in areas. And right now we're thinking about the forest resilience bond in Chile, in Mexico, whether it's fire or flood risk reduction. You know, will it work? We'll see, but the opportunity is there and the need is there.
Thanks, Todd. Whilst you're on the line, can you answer Rachel's question about forest bonds being replicable for privately owned land, the governance challenges related to multiple owners?
That's a great question. And so we have attempted to pilot this approach on private lands. What we found is, you know, we call it, you need an anchor tenant, right? When you're dealing with the Forest Service, there's tens or even hundreds of thousands of acres that can serve as the anchor for the contracting. And then can you build in private lands around that to create economies of scale? like carbon markets and a lot of other things in this space, the transaction cost of trying to aggregate individual small landowners often makes the economics, a negative ROI, to be blunt. So that's what we found. Having that anchor tenant does allow you to bring on smaller landholders and private lands.
Brilliant, thanks for that. Brad, I think you had your hand up. I can't see you on the screen anymore. If you're there, do you want to come in with your question? Was that Brad Johnson? If not, Monica, I see your hands up and you're on my screen, so you're in the frame.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was super inspiring to hear all these examples, but I was just wondering how all of you are working, to document maybe these experiences, but also leave some part of that wisdom at local level, because this complex, this blended finance is every time there was already very limited capacity at local level to structure, let's say, the simple infrastructure project. So we get to these, and I do think it's very political still, that choice at local level. How can you leave some of that capacity to design a fit for purpose implementation / blended finance arrangement? That would be great to hear.
Great. Does one of the panelists want to respond to that? Was that directed at Monica? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Well, no, I don't know. For example, Ella was talking all these models, right? But the process to get to choose one or another model, or anyone here, how is that done? How the local capacity is being created for people to then say, this is an orange, how do I finance it? This is a pear, how do I do that?
Yeah. I don't know if Ella from the Philippines, whether you felt that was a good example. I remember you talking about local government being involved in the planning of that. Ella, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks so much for your question, Monica. Nice to see you again on a roundtable. So in terms of the blended finance, I would say we've had some really good successes. Again, in the Philippines with a blended, the Philippine Water Revolving Fund, but in terms, and then that mobilized 200 million, and then now it's no longer there. And so what's the next generation, right? How do you get from 200, Bill was talking about trillions? And that's really where we're a little stuck, to tell you the truth, right? So for me, a lot of it is how can we work together, the people on this call and who are not in this call, to be able to do this? Because 200 million sounds great, but we got to go bigger. And how do we work, which institutions? So again, this is not something that's in our strategy yet, but how do we work with national development banks, for instance, which we've already done, but maybe kind of a 2.0 version. I think an example from DBSA was also mentioned. How do we work at the provincial level in countries with higher capacity that has more decentralized governments? And so that's where we're focusing a lot of our work, not just and really at the transaction level, but on the governance level and capacity strengthening, so that we can get to these fit for purpose implementation arrangements, so that I'm not just talking about one fund that ended and now what's next, right? So I'm sorry, I don't have such an answer, because it's something that I think we're all struggling with and would love to. It's really at the collective action level that we can solve it together with the people in this call.
Brilliant.
You.
Thanks, Ella. Great answer there. I'm going to go to Gail now. There's a couple of questions, Gail, in the chat. From Vedika. Hearing about the second fund, there were a couple of quick questions there. I don't know if you can see them. What's the typical size of investment that you expect to make in each of the 3 sub-funds? And also for the first close, what would be the size of each of the 3 sub-funds? And then there's one a little bit later on that I will dig out. Yeah, it was about the capacity challenges surrounding your investments and the business model, including the lack of familiarity of some of the EPC contractors with the privately financed deals and the PPP capacity in government. Can you handle those ones, Gare?
Yeah, I think no problem. So first of all, the size, as I mentioned, at the moment we can do investments of roughly 10 million, and we can up to 75% we can finance for the construction phase. After January, we can do up to 150 million, again, up to 75% of the total project costs. That's for the construction phase. For the development phase, it's currently somewhere between 2 and 5 million, and we can probably go a little bit higher after January. So that's order of magnitude of that. The development fund, so the first fund, we probably aim to be somewhere between 50 and 100 million. The construction equity fund is probably somewhere between, as I said earlier, between, let's say, 600 and 1 billion. And the refinancing fund, we haven't established that yet because we don't need it yet, because we first need the other projects. So you're not going to create what you don't need yet. It only costs money. So we're going to create that. We are in the process of creating that because we will soon need it for refinancing transactions that we have established and have gone through our first fund. So we are working on how would we actually have that. Obviously, as we know, the debt market is quite liquid. It is not like there's a lack of money. And so once you have well-established infrastructure projects that operate, that work, that generate their cash flows, it shouldn't be too complicated to refinance them on the market. So that's part of what we're looking at now. What is the value added of having our own refi fund? And in what cases do you still need that type of refi compared to what the general market can give at the moment? And then you're looking probably also at countries that are maybe not that easy to get attract foreign direct investments. So that's part of the work that we're doing at the moment on the refi side. But it's for the second fund, it's definitely not something that we do a lot of work on at the moment. So the capacity question, yeah, that's I think probably one of the things that we have learned is that for a lot of the places that we feel that we have a competitive advantage compared to some of the other financing available, you are in countries where you do not have a strongly established private sector in the water sector. You do have, of course, EPC contractors. They can build stuff and tender and actually get it done. But that doesn't mean that they actually know how to actually develop an entire project. They probably know the technical side, but all the other sides of it, the financing and the legal side, the structuring, organizing all the stakeholders, everybody joyfully sitting around the table, or all the ESG aspects. So there are quite a few other aspects, of course, of developing a project that those actors are not familiar with. And we see that we often, on some of those aspects, we step in with our own team, or we mobilize additional resource to help and support the development of the project. But there's, of course, limits to how much you can actually do that. So it's also then building the capacity of those developers themselves to actually be able to develop. Similarly, with government, we see quite a challenge. You might have a PPP unit in the Ministry in Treasury that actually knows what they're talking about, but quickly beyond that, in the line ministries that you have to deal with, I would say the knowledge and experience and know-how gets quickly very thin. And so there's a lot of education in the process of developing these ideas. That's not a formal training per se, but it is a lot of PowerPoints and explanation of how these mechanisms work. So you do development, support, capacity development as part of the development, but it's not a separate training program that we put in place.
Thanks a lot, Gail. Brilliant answers. I'm going to go to Yongdyok now. There's a question specifically for you. ESG issues, how are they addressed in the Solomon Island HPP? Interesting one.
Thank you so much. And I think the ESG, the environmental, social and governance is really important to impact to have a successful world project in all of the world. I think regarding in order to solve those problems, we discuss a lot with the residents and the governments and stakeholders. For example, the environmental point is, as I mentioned before, they develop electricity using diesel, and in order to solve those problems, we approach the hydropower, and social part, and the Solomon government want to develop their economic situation. How we can do that? That one is, if you supply, low cost, low tariff for electricity, they can develop another thing. And the governance part, and we have, public hearing a lot with, residents, and also reimbursement and job securing, and we have some capacity building. Because next time, after construction, they need to develop another project and the financial supporting, and how can they develop finance and technology, and et cetera, et cetera. And also, to develop this water project, we discuss a lot, the Australia government and MDB and the World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. So as we discuss, the Brandy, the finance is really important, and I think the important thing is the small island project. We need to decrease the tax. How we can decrease tax? That one is the best way is we got the low interest concession loan is the best way. So the as I mentioned, we approved the ESG, the kind of the environmental impact assessment, and later than based upon that result, we approached the the ADB and IDB and the other MDB, and this is kind of a very good project. And after that, we can make a successful branded finance. Thank you.
Thanks, Young-dok. Great answer. We're coming towards the end. I think we're finishing in about 5-7 minutes. So I thought I'd pick out one of the general questions that I think has emerged from this discussion, which has been very rich. And I would encourage you to look on the chat. There's some answers to some of the questions, and further resources have been flagged there. I think it was Andrew, was it Wilson, who put up how much money there is sloshing around. And I heard Gare say the same thing. There's so much money out there. Why can't we connect it to the water sector better, particularly in developing countries? So what are the challenges and the barriers, and how do we overcome them? And I'm going to put this to each one of you, if you don't mind, as a way of summarizing and closing out the session, and then you don't have to hear me droning on with a summary. Let's go from the top. Does anybody want to go first with that? Gare, do you want to come in first?
If that works.
You go first.
I think what we have seen so far is that the local financing is available once a project is there. We also, as I said, the lack of capacity of understanding what it actually all means to go through a whole process of such development phases, all the works that need to be done, and the risks associated, not only in the development phase, but also in the construction phase. And sort of local finance, which you talk, for example, pension funds, are not really interested, and they often are not even allowed to take the associated risks. And so hence you have to, they are very happy to come in at that later stage when we talk about refinancing, because then you of course have taken out the development risk, you take out the construction risk, and you actually have a functioning infrastructure project. So that I would say is probably a role for that type of capital to play, and not thinking that that capital will actually start at the beginning. It just simply is very unlikely that it will. However, then of course we still have a little gap, and I think Hubert was also pointing out that there's a role to play. I see that Arnoud is also here in the room supporting CI2, and so what we see is having a mechanism like CI2, and we would be very happy if there are more than only CI2, one CI2. We would be very happy if there are. Based on the experience that we have, we develop other CI2s for the water sector that might actually have a slightly different mechanism.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gare.
So
we should move on to some others, but thank you so much for that rich experience to share. Who wants to go next? Hubert, do you want to have another go?
Yeah, I can have a
all
go.
This money sloshing around.
Yeah, no, I spent half of my working life. I spent half of my working life with the big French water companies, so now I'm redeeming myself. But no, the problem is that there is not one size fits all. And the regulation in the country are critical, the legal framework, and trying to push PPP into a country that is not ready for it is a recipe for disaster and give basically a bad name to private sector financing. So I think we need to sort country that can basically go through the motion, and then we can try to do something. I frankly admire the approach that Bill Kingdom did in Vietnam in the early 2000s, and I follow through with Asian Development Bank, benefiting from all his work. And you see in Vietnam basically sector work done by Bill, and try to work through design build lease to basically build up the private sector capacity. Then Asian Development Bank following with a 10 years water sector investment program of $1 billion in order to help newly corporatized water entity. And now the Vietnam water sector is privatized. So I think Vietnam is a good success story. It took 20 years to happen, but now they are there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hubert. Let's look to Vietnam for some more examples, perhaps in the next session, Kathleen. Ella, do you want to have a go from USAID? I'd love to hear how you think ODA could be used to encourage private sector investment, because I'm really struggling with that from the UK point of view.
Yeah, I've actually been managing this program called WashFin to mobilize public and private finance in the sector. So I must say that it's been hard to mobilize private finance. And that's because we really need to look at the fundamentals of the sector. And Bill talked about mobilizing domestic finance. I definitely agree with him. But we need to look at the policy, and Hubert was saying that policy, legal, and regulatory framework bottlenecks. I'm now going to be charged with saying the most boring things in the panel,
but it needs saying, doesn't it?
But we got to get back to basics and being able to use technical assistance to do that, and work with our government partners, working with financial institutions, and get them more comfortable in the sector through piloting some transactions, but really working at that overall macro framework is important. And lastly, I did want to just there was a question in the other panel about what about corporates, and that's also something that USAID has been working in. We have a partnership with Gap Inc., also working with Danone. How do you tap into the corporates and actually get them not just to achieve their net zero emission targets, but also work on water access and infrastructure across their value chain? And so more to come later as we engage more in the corporate water stewardship space. So, thank
Brilliant.
you.
Thank you, Ella. No, I agree with and understand a lot of what you're talking about. The boring stuff is actually the hard stuff that needs fixing. Todd, do you want to come in and relate the forest experience to water? Do you think we can get insurance companies paying for water investment?
No, I do. And I think when you think about the developing world context, there's no substitute to having preparatory facilities and accelerator type programs where, you know, in some cases you're working utility by utility and city by city, but I'm not sure what the substitute is. It's about sequencing of the funding and financing, and that's the role for, you know, UK ODA funds and USAID, et cetera, to help build out that pipeline from idea origination to something that's actually investable for the private sector. We've had some level of success in Brazil and in Mexico, and then really trying to figure out how we efficiently share those lessons to get others up to speed. We also need to be pragmatic about, you know, a pilot, scale in situ, right? And then sort of replicate and contextualize to other locations. And then finally, I think Ella's point on the corporate sector, you know, as a complement to traditional private finance is key. A lot of the major food and beverage companies are setting really ambitious water targets, but haven't fully figured out how to meet them outside of their own fence line. And so with nature-based solutions and adaptation type funding, they're going to need to be a critical player at the table. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Todd. Yongdok, do you have any final comments to make on this question of unleashing the private finance in this space?
Thank you so much for giving me a final chance to speak. And I think the financing issue is risk assessment, risk management is a really important point. Therefore, this day, we started that project with the OECD, AWG, and the Ministry of Environment of Korea. And I think the policy, technology, and the finance should be mingled up. They should be making one spot. Like in order to do that, we starting the Thailand firstly, and the second Indonesia, and the next we're gonna do the Cambodia and Laos. And we have a target the 10 countries, and firstly what is the main issue of those countries, like regarding water, and secondly what kind of technology they need, and lastly the finance. So if we do that, as I mentioned before, in order to overcome risk assessment and risk management. So in the first beginning stage, from the beginning stage, the government and private sector working together, what is the problem, and trying to find best solution. I think this is the best way, the least risk of finance.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And I will have to bring it to a close now. Been very rich discussion. I've got 2 words to add to that: subsidy and pricing. With that, I'll hand over to Kathleen to wrap up for the day. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Andy. I mean, well done and finished exactly right on time. Beautiful job to steer us through that discussion. Lots of inspiring examples. And I think it's been a really productive and interesting day. I want to say first, thank you to all the participants who connected, who've, been really engaged in the chat, asking questions, responding. That's really the idea behind the roundtable, is to create that kind of dynamic discussion. So, so pleased that we were able to achieve that today, even in the virtual world. Let me also, of course, thank all of our speakers for taking the time, for keeping it short and concise, but also really inspiring. Actually, we covered a huge amount of terrain, I think, in terms of ways in which we see water and climate linked so tightly, and how water security can be part of climate solutions and climate action. Also, let me thank, of course, our skillful chairs, Andy and Ingrid. You guys had your work cut out for you, but did a fabulous job. I want to just say that we have a team behind the scenes who have been taking very detailed notes about these examples and ideas, and so we will be doing our best to capture these points in a summary. But we will be continuing this discussion tomorrow, and that's where I want to just take another 2 minutes of your time to encourage you to reconnect tomorrow, because we have a very, very, I think, fascinating discussion lined up on 2 topics that we haven't explored as much to date in these discussions around financing water. And the first one is looking at how environmental risks, including water risks, can translate into material financial risk to the financial system. And this is an emerging discussion and potentially very important dynamic that we're seeing, and making clear links around the understanding between the potential exposure of the finance community to those environmental and water risks, and how that can be a first step to potentially redirecting mainstream financing flows towards investments that, at a minimum, don't increase exposure and vulnerability to water risk, but help contribute to water security and climate action. So that's a very important discussion. And we have a keynote speaker, Frank Elderson, who is an executive board member and also vice chair of the supervisory board from the European Central Bank. If you've been watching the news on this, the ECB just released a climate stress test just a couple of days ago. And so this is very hot off the press and important topic. And then our fourth and final session will be looking at how improved access to finance and better targeting of existing financing flows can contribute not just to water and climate action, but also to broader policy and societal goals. And that includes environmental justice, serving vulnerable communities, historically underserved communities, and also women's empowerment. And there we've got just an absolutely fantastic panel lined up, and that will be chaired by Vedika Bandakar, who's the COO of Water.org, and she's with us here today. We're very excited about that. We'll also hear from other roundtable partners, Henk Oving, Franz Rojas from the CAF, but also representing World Water Council, and Jennifer Sarah from the World Bank to wrap it all up. So that's it. That's my pitch to you to think about connecting again tomorrow. And let me say a final thank you for all the contributions and really active engagement. And with that, we can wrap up for the day. And I hope to see you all tomorrow.